Fantastic. So, hi everyone, my name is Heffernan, and this is indeed Eugene Sandow, a Prussian-born physical culturist famed throughout the world for his strength, muscularity, and good looks. Admired by men, adored by women, Sandow was a Schwarzenegger of the early 20th century. And although more synonymous with Great Britain, this wandering muscle man made quite a splash in colonial Ireland. You see, in 1898, Sandow became the talk of both Dublin and Belfast following a month-long theatrical performance. During shows, he would rip packs of playing cards in two, hold members of the audience aloft in one hand, and pose his muscles for all and sundry. Sandow, in short, was the star attraction. Irish doctors labelled him fit as a bell, Irish men sought to emulate his training methods, while certain groups of Irish women took a much greater interest in physical fitness. Performers would proclaim themselves to be the next Sandow or the Irish Sandow, and a few brewers would even use his image to promote pints. A higher compliment in Ireland, surely there is not. And as the years progressed, Sandow's influence continued to grow. Eddie O'Callaghan was tasked with selling the Prussians' workout devices to an eager Irish public, something he did with great success. Sandow's works were sold throughout the 32 counties, and a few brave souls even entered his bodybuilding competition of 1901, which was held in London. But Sandow's greatest influence in Ireland was not his business success, but rather the support, the encouragement he gave to the budding Irish physical culture movement. Sandow did not create this phenomenon, but he did help to accelerate his popularity, both socially and, as we'll come to learn in a few moments, politically. Now, in the first instance, one sees a veritable explosion of physical culture, clubs, gymnasiums, and competitions emerging in Ireland in the late 1890s. Catering to both the middle and working classes, such groups sought to reform the Irish body for the better through dumbbell work, Indian club swing, various forms of calisthenics, and really any form of purposeful exercise. What's more, such clubs populated the entire country. For children, the new interest in physical culture would see drill introduced into the classroom alongside dumbbells, Indian clubs, and even pommel horses. Out in the wild, Irish boys and girls were being recruited by scouting movements seeking to blend military know-how with a very specialised sort of Irish fitness. For men of the requisite age and disposition, physical culture gymnasiums promised to increase your vitality, attractiveness, and even your social mobility. Such men included, quite famously, Joyce's protagonist in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, who took to Sandow's exercise system in the hope of regaining, restoring, or perhaps revitalising a perceived loss in his own masculinity. And though the systems and languages differed for women, a common theme in the Irish zeitgeist during this time was that physical culture would make Irish women more attractive, more graceful, increase their suppleness, and even make them better mothers or daughters. And while such messages were ubiquitous in the Irish press, they also came from supposed health experts, such as Sandow himself. Now, for our sporting friends, physical culture, of course, had a competitive edge, and to that end, the 1890s would see a series of drill and gymnastic competitions emerge in Ireland. As physical culture's popularity grew, such competitions extended outwards into weightlifting, dumbbell work, Indian club swing, and even at times rudimentary bodybuilding. Yet, as the 1900s began to close in on the 1910s, it became apparent that something was rotten in the state of Ireland, to paraphrase the great bard. You see, Ireland was moving closer to some form of self-determination. Political opposition was growing, and with physical culture's popularity at its height, the two movements became juxtaposed in the most interesting and indeed perhaps tragic of ways. Now, the most obvious opposition came from those seeking to retain the union with Great Britain. Called Unionists, funnily enough, such groups began to mobilise in 1913 in preparation for Home Rule and its perceived ensuing chaos. Now, of course, mobilising men meant a much greater need for fit and healthy bodies, and to that end, the Unionists began to drill in earnest in very large numbers. Men were led by former army instructors to retrain their bodies and to train within tactical formations. Men were taught to retrain their bodies within their own private time. Indeed, men were taught to contemplate or reflect on their own body's physical readiness for a perceived ensuing battle. But Unionist training extended so much more beyond drill. You see, soon Unionist squadrons are renting premises under the guise of physical culture, using physical culture systems, and indeed a language of physical culture to try and advance their aims and their motives. Physical culture was being politicised in Ireland in the early 1910s in a way not possible or not thought of as possible during Sandow's sojourn in Ireland. And while it was Unionists who arguably kick-started this trend, nationalist groups such as the Irish Volunteers were not far behind. Indeed, within months of the Unionist call to arms in 1913, Owen McNeill was calling on Irish nationalists to similarly mobilise in drill formation. Once more, physical culture, the Irish body and politics were were being intertwined. And again, the volunteers made great use of sport and exercise, as evidenced by this Volunteer Sports Day from 1913. But there was one interesting difference. Nationalists were promoting physical culture across the life cycle through youth movements, and indeed across class lines in a much greater way. And quite interestingly, two of the leaders of the failed 1916 insurrection were unabashed physical culture promoters. The first, Joseph Plunkett, used Sandow's exercise system to rebuild his own muscles. The second, Patrick Pearse, promoted physical culture at his gymnasium in Dublin in St Enda's, which is pictured above. And while the actions of the 1916 insurrection came to naught, at least in the short term, the nationalist support or the nationalist mobilisation following the insurrection would continue to grow during these years. And indeed, more men would take to the nationalist cause, more men would take to nationalist training, and more men would take a nationalist ethos. Now, the period 1919 to 1921 would see Irish nationalists rebel against English rule once more. Far from diminished, physical culture's role had in fact been heightened, as certain groups within the IRA had been trained by physical culture instructors to make them fighting fit in every sense of the word. Sandow's legacy even lived on thanks to the rebel fighter Dan Sandow O'Sullivan, nicknamed owing to his resemblance to the Prussian. Thus, muscle making was no small issue in Ireland. It permeated social and political life to an unprecedented scale. And while my short story traced from bloom to battle, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Physical culture permeated social, sexual, economic, political, gender, and sporting histories in Ireland. And if you're interested in learning more, please do feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Tell you what, we've had some polished Petra pictures today. Any questions?
I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question, given the wide scope of social, political, or whatever.
I just throw that in, saying fancy.
But I've seen illustrations of Sandow with women feeling his muscles. Do you know if he charged money for that?
It is a genuine question. I think initially he didn't charge money, but he went on a tour of the United States in the early 1890s, and we met the famous showman, Ziegfeld, and he convinced Sandow to start charging for these shows. So certainly, when he came to Ireland in 1898, he held these private posing sessions where men and women of the requisite wealth and interest would come and feel his muscles, and it was seen as educational at the time. Obviously, there are massive sexual undertones to everything that I'm working in, but certainly it was promoted as respectable because in Ireland he did the private posing session, and then he lectured Irish doctors right afterwards, where he was still stripped down in his loincloth, I think it would have been at the time. But yeah, people paid to feel him up, for want of a better word. Thanks.
Yes.
I wonder if you've solved the problem that I've been wrestling with for a long time. I haven't even shown this particular photograph today. It's an Alec Nelson photograph, taken probably around the turn of the century, where he's obviously posing for some purpose. I mean, he's got some fur-type thing around his midriff, but basically it's emphasising his physical stature and so on. Around 1900, now, does what you're talking about in terms of this cult, this notion of worship of the of physical perfection, if you like, would that fit in terms of applying in Britain at that stage? Do you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Britain is quite literally the metropole of physical culture during this time, and Sandow is based in London, and he's touring the world from his base in London. So even his "I am established in Dublin" advertisements, if you apply to that, your case study is being notionally referred to Sandow in London. So it's hugely English based. Obviously there are indigenous movements, but certainly Sandow's tours around the world and those of other Englishmen did help to promote it, but very much heavily English, I suppose. Thanks.
Hans, did you want to ask that question?
Yeah.
That'll be the last one.
When it becomes a nationalist agenda, you're doing it for Ireland and for independence, does that affect the way that sports are looked at? Does it mean that you see that the patriotic thing is to protect the body, so there's a movement away from sports games at the same time, or do they coexist together?
I have to put my cards on the table. The GA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, is the main kind of training ground, and a lot of the discourses around the GA is around a muscular Gael. I'm trying to pivot physical culture in and gain a place of physical culture within that, because Irish sporting history has, for obvious reasons, tended to focus on the GAA. So certainly the discourses of the GAA are using a language of physical culture, and they're actually mentioning Sandow and his training methods, but it certainly has a subservient position, I would say, to the role of certain sporting organisations within Ireland. But that might all change, who knows?
Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much.